Have you ever stopped to think about why certain people seem to perceive the world as if they have an extra sense? As if there were a layer of reality that most people simply don't notice, and that for some specific individuals, that layer is just as real as the ground beneath their feet? There's a type of mind that was not built to function within the limits the world considers normal. And if you made it to this video, there's a very strong chance that you are one of those people. Or that you know someone like that, and never knew how to explain what you see in them. What you are about to discover here is not self-help. This is not yet another piece of content about introverts that rehashes the same ideas you have already heard 100 times. And this is an honest mapping of a psychological type that Carl Gustav Jung identified as one of the rarest and most misunderstood in all of humanity, and that Friedrich Nietzsche, in his own way, recognized as the type the world has always tried to silence. If you have spent your entire life feeling like you think too much, feel too much, notice things others don't, and yet still wonder whether something is wrong with you, this video was made specifically for your mind. I know it is hard to hear that without a certain skepticism. After all, you were taught to doubt your own perception. But pay close attention until the end, because what comes next may be the first time someone names with precision what you have always felt and could never put into words. There is a silent narrative that runs through the entire lives of certain people. It begins in childhood, when a child asks questions that adults cannot answer. Not because the child is slow, but because they see connections that others have not yet processed. That child grows up being told they are too sensitive, that they overthink everything, that they make simple things complicated. At school, they learn that the correct answers are the objective ones, the measurable ones, the ones that fit neatly inside a multiple-choice box. Whatever does not fit in that box is considered wrong, or at best, irrelevant. What happens to that child over time is systematic. It is not individual cruelty. It is the logic of a world that was built to value the concrete, the immediate, the verifiable. A world that needs people who execute tasks, meet deadlines, and accept hierarchies without questioning their foundations. That system has no natural space for minds that live inside symbols, that perceive invisible patterns, that need silence to process what most people do not even realize exists. And so the system does what it always does with what it does not understand. It tries to fix it. Jung identified this with a clarity that still impresses today. In his Theory of Psychological Types, published in 1921, he described how different functions of consciousness, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, organize themselves in radically different ways across people. More than that, he identified that certain types, especially the introverted intuitive, operate on a frequency that the majority of the population simply does not access. Not due to incapacity on either side, but because they are fundamentally different cognitive structures, like two musical instruments that were never tuned to play in the same key. The problem is not you. It never was. The problem is that you spent your entire life trying to tune your instrument to play in a key that was never yours. And every time the sound came out different, someone in a position of authority would say, "That is wrong. Play it again. Play it like everyone else." What no one ever told you is that the different sound coming out of you was not a tuning error. It was the rarest note in the orchestra. And most people simply do not have the trained ear to recognize what it is capable of. To understand what is really at stake here, we need to go deep into what Jung actually meant when he described the introverted intuitive. No, we're not talking about a simple shy person who likes to stay home. Jungian typology is far more precise and far more profound than that popular oversimplification. Jung proposed that every consciousness has 4 basic functions of perception and judgment, and that each person has one dominant function, which drives most of how they process reality. Intuition, as Jung understood it, is not a gut feeling. It is not that vague sensation casually called a sixth sense. Jungian intuition is a specific cognitive function. It perceives possibilities, underlying patterns, connections that have not yet become conscious for most people. It operates below the radar of rational analysis, not because it is irrational, but because it accesses layers of information that linear thinking has not yet processed. It is as if intuition were a camera with a far wider angle than the ordinary human eye is capable of capturing. When this dominant function combines with introversion, meaning when it is turned inward toward the symbols and images that inhabit the unconscious, the result is a psychological type that literally processes reality in a way that no other type does. The introverted intuitive does not see what is on the surface. They see what is beneath the surface. And this, which should be recognized as an extraordinary ability, is frequently lived as a burden, because the surrounding world insists on only validating what sits on the surface. Jung estimated that intuitive types are a significant minority within the population, and that among them, introverted intuitives are even rarer. And this means something concrete, that the majority of social, professional, and cultural structures were created by different types, for different types. Not out of malice, but because majorities build the world in their own image. And when you are one of the few who functions differently, the inevitable feeling is that of being in the wrong place. Not because you are wrong, but because that specific place was genuinely not designed for your inner architecture. And here is the first point that needs to be absolutely clear. Being rare is not a defect. Rarity is specificity. A rare instrument is not a broken instrument. It is an instrument that requires a musician with a different ear to recognize what it is capable of producing. The introverted intuitive has spent their life trying to fit into a world that was never made for them, and has carried the blame for not being able to. That weight begins to dissolve when you understand that the problem was never your nature. It was always the absence of a map. There is an experience that almost every introverted intuitive recognizes the moment someone describes it with precision. It is that feeling of knowing something before you can prove it, of sensing tension in a relationship before it surfaces, of feeling that an environment is about to shift before any concrete sign confirms it, of seeing something in a person they have not yet shown, and being ignored when you try to mention what you noticed until it is confirmed weeks or months later. This phenomenon has an explanation that goes beyond mysticism. Although mysticism is also a valid language for describing it, Jung called it active unconscious perception, the process by which the psyche picks up patterns of information that have not yet reached the level of rational consciousness. The human brain processes a massive amount of data every second, far more than consciousness can encompass. Most of that information remains in the unconscious, where it is processed in parallel, beyond the reach of direct analysis. What the introverted intuitive does, naturally and often involuntarily, is access part of that unconscious information before it becomes conscious. They read micro-expressions they did not consciously register. They pick up on inconsistencies in tone of voice that the other person did not even realize they emitted. And they integrate behavioral patterns over time in a way the analytical mind is still working through. And the result shows up as intuition, as a knowing that arrived before the explanation. The problem is that this process is invisible to others. When the introverted intuitive says, "I feel like something is off here," without being able to present objective data to support that perception, the most common response is dismissal. "You are imagining things. Stop being dramatic. That is just paranoia." And then the cycle begins. The perception is ignored, the event is confirmed later, and the introverted intuitive slowly learns to silence what they notice. Because noticing without being able to prove it comes with a social cost. That silencing carries a steep price. When a genuine ability is systematically discredited, it does not disappear. It converts into anxiety. What should be processed as perception becomes a nameless tension, a constant restlessness that finds no outlet through speech because speech was taught as dangerous. and the introverted intuitive learns to inhabit that space between knowing and not being allowed to say it. A space that is, at the same time, their greatest depth and their greatest loneliness. But here is what no one says. This ability, when recognized and cultivated, is extraordinarily rare. The capacity to perceive patterns before they manifest, to anticipate relational and systemic dynamics ahead of time, to read subtexts that most people ignore. This is the ability that great therapists, writers, strategic leaders, and artists describe when they talk about what drives them. It is not madness. It is high-resolution sensitivity. And the world has a historical tendency to persecute what it does not understand until it needs it. Connected to this capacity to perceive what is coming, there is another ability that the introverted intuitive carries in an almost compulsory way: the perception of incoherence, not as an intellectual choice, as an involuntary reception. It is like having an internal detector that quietly sounds off every time what someone says does not match what someone feels. When an institutional promise has no real substance behind it. When a smile carries tension that the face is trying to conceal. This is not paranoia. Paranoia is the perception of threats that do not exist. What the introverted intuitive does is different. It is the reading of patterns that do exist, but that most people have not trained themselves to see. It is the difference between a poorly calibrated lie detector and one that simply operates with greater sensitivity. The problem lies in the social cost of that perception, because in a world that frequently prefers performative coherence over uncomfortable truth, the person who points out the incoherence is rarely welcome. Think about a work meeting where everyone agrees on a decision that clearly is not going to work. The introverted intuitive perceives this before any formal analysis. They feel the discrepancy between the room's enthusiasm and the fragility of the assumptions. But when they try to articulate that perception, they hear that they are being negative, resistant to change, not a team player. The decision is implemented. It fails exactly where they had sensed the fracture. And no one comes back to ask how they knew. This cycle, perceiving, being silenced, seeing it confirmed, not being acknowledged, is one of the most draining experiences the introverted intuitive carries. And it is also one of the ones that most contributes to that deep sense of not belonging that so many describe. It is not that they do not want to connect. It is that real connection, for them, requires authenticity. And in environments where incoherence is the norm, authenticity is the scarcest element available. Jung described this phenomenon within his theory of the persona, the social mask that each person constructs to navigate the collective world. Most people can inhabit their persona with relative comfort, adjusting it as the environment demands. The introverted intuitive, however, has a specific difficulty with this. Their perception of incoherence makes them highly conscious of other people's personas and deeply uncomfortable with the need to sustain their own. The result is that they frequently come across as too intense, too serious, or impossible to please. Not because they are arrogant, but simply because they cannot pretend not to see what they see. Cultivating that perception without being consumed by it is one of the central challenges for this type. But before talking about that, we need to understand another dimension that deeply defines their experience: silence. There is a fundamental misunderstanding about the introverted intuitive silence that creates relational problems over and over again. When they go quiet in a conversation, the most common interpretation is that they are disinterested, bored, closed off, or being passive-aggressive. When they need time alone after social interactions, they are seen as someone with relationship difficulties, or worse, as someone who does not like the people around them. These interpretations are almost always mistaken, and the mistake has real consequences. Silence, for the introverted intuitive, is not absence. It is the processing environment. It is the space where the multiple layers of a conversation, a situation, a perception are integrated in a way that constant talking simply does not allow. Imagine trying to solve a complex equation while someone talks relentlessly in your ear. For most people, silence is the background, the space between things. For the introverted intuitive, silence is the foreground. It is where the most important processing happens. Jung understood inner withdrawal as the channel of access to the unconscious. Not silence as escapism, but silence as practice, as the state in which the ego quiets itself enough for other layers of the psyche to be heard. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung describes long periods of withdrawal and contemplation that were, for him, not an escape from reality, but a way of diving into dimensions of it that the noisy external world did not allow him to access. For the introverted intuitive, that withdrawal is not optional. It is physiological. It is the way their nervous system regulates information overload. At a 3-hour party, they do not absorb only the conversations they had. They absorb the subtexts of every interaction they observed, the unspoken tensions in the room, the incoherences in people's smiles, the quality of the space, the weight of the atmosphere. When they leave, they need silence not out of shyness, but because they are literally processing a volume of information that most people simply did not pick up on. The silence is not passive rest. It is active work of integration. The problem is that the contemporary world has a deeply suspicious relationship with silence. In an age where the absence of stimulation is immediately filled with a phone screen, earbuds, a podcast playing in the background, voluntary silence is perceived as something strange, almost unsettling. And the person who needs it, who actively seeks it out, who organizes their life around moments of quiet, it is quickly labeled antisocial, depressed, or simply hard to understand. What needs to be stated clearly is that the introverted intuitive silence is not a symptom of anything. It is technology. It is the specific tool through which this type accesses what is deepest in themselves, and, by extension, what is deepest in the reality around them. Taking that tool away does not make them more functional. It only makes them more anxious, more disconnected from themselves, and progressively less capable of accessing the abilities that make them unique. It is like taking the telescope away from the astronomer and telling them they will connect better with people that way. There is a dimension of the introverted intuitive's experience that is rarely spoken about honestly, and that needs to be named without excessive romanticization, but also without the pathologizing the world tends to apply to it. It is loneliness. Not loneliness as a passing state, but as a structural condition, as something that does not disappear even when there are people around. Sometimes, especially when there are people around. Nietzsche wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that the higher individual needs solitude not as a punishment imposed by the world, but as a condition they seek out themselves. Because it is only in the space free of other people's noise that truly elevated thinking finds ground to grow. Nietzsche was not romanticizing isolation. He was describing a functional need of certain types of minds. The need for a space where thought does not have to defend itself, justify itself, or adapt to the pace of those who do not think the same way. The introverted intuitive does not choose solitude because they cannot relate to others. They choose, or rather are drawn, to solitude because it is the only space where their mind operates without the constant cost of translation. In the social world, they are permanently translating what they perceive into a language others can accept, translating what they feel into a form that will not frighten anyone, translating what they see into a framing that will not be dismissed as unnecessary intensity. That translation is exhausting. Solitude is the space where there is nothing to translate, where they can simply be what they are, think how they think, feel what they feel, without the constant vigilance of being too much. The problem is not solitude itself. The problem is the judgment that contemporary culture imposes on it. In a world that equates connection with the quantity of social interactions, that measures relational health by the number of commitments on a calendar, the need for solitude is seen as a sign of something that needs to be fixed. The introverted intuitive is frequently pressured by family, by partners, by work environments to be more present, more available, more outgoing. And every time they give in to that pressure without having processed what they need to process, they lose a little more access to themselves. What Nietzsche intuited and Jung articulated is that there is a fundamental difference between solitude as escape and solitude as practice. So solitude as escape is reactive. It is the isolation that happens when contact with the world becomes unbearable and the only response is to pull back. Solitude as practice is intentional. It is the conscious withdrawal that renews, that deepens, that allows the introverted intuitive to return to the world with more clarity, more presence, more capacity for genuine contribution. The first is a symptom. The second is wisdom. And the difference between the two defines much of the psychological health of this type. If you are enjoying this content, check out the link in the first comment for our exclusive ebook, Alchemy and Archetypes, a resource that goes far beyond what fits in a video, and that was made specifically for those on this journey of inner recognition and deepening. There is an ability the introverted intuitive carries so naturally that they often do not recognize it as an ability at all. It is the capacity to read symbolically, to inhabit symbols, to find layers of meaning in places where others see only form. A song playing on the radio is not just a song. It is an emotional map of something that has not yet been named. A dream is not just a random image. It is a message coming from somewhere deeper than the conscious mind can reach. A coincidence is not just a coincidence. It is a pattern pointing towards something that rational analysis has not yet connected. Jung built much of his work on exactly this capacity, and was widely ridiculed for it in certain academic circles, just as the introverted intuitive is frequently ridiculed for finding meaning where others see only noise. In Man and His Symbols, Jung argued that a symbol is not an illustration of something that could already be said in another way. The symbol is the only language capable of expressing certain realities, especially those that inhabit the unconscious, where linear logic simply cannot reach. For the introverted intuitive, this relationship with symbols is not intellectual. It is visceral. It is the way they process reality. When they read a poem and feel that something in it describes precisely what they had been trying to articulate for months, that is not projection. It is recognition. When they see an image in a film that captures with precision something from their inner experience, it is not that the film influenced them. It is that the symbol named what was already there, waiting to be named. This symbolically rich inner life is, at the same time, their greatest wealth and their greatest source of misunderstanding, because those who do not have that kind of relationship with symbols frequently interpret as drama or overreaction what is, in fact, a sophisticated form of processing experience. The inner life of the introverted intuitive is not only rich in symbolic images while awake, it is also extraordinarily active while asleep. The dreams of this type tend to be more vivid, more narratively elaborate, and more loaded with images that persist in memory than the dreams of most people. And it is not a coincidence. Jung dedicated decades to the study of dreams as the privileged language of the unconscious, both personal and collective. For him, dreams were not the random result of neurons firing during sleep. They were communications, sometimes direct, and sometimes highly symbolic, from parts of the psyche that waking consciousness had ignored or repressed. In Psychology and Alchemy, and in his autobiography, Jung describes how his own dreams were fundamental guides on his journey of individuation, the process of becoming progressively who one truly is. The introverted intuitive, by their natural orientation toward the interior, has a relationship with dreams that goes beyond what most people experience. They not only remember dreams more frequently, they often return to them during the day, process the images that appeared in them, and identify connections between what they dreamed and what they are living. For more extroverted or sensory types, this behavior can seem excessive or even unsettling. For the introverted intuitive, it is simply the way their psyche communicates with itself. And ignoring that communication does not make it go quiet. It only pushes it into less conscious forms of expression. Cultivating a conscious relationship with dreams. Keeping a dream journal, setting aside a few minutes of silence after waking to let the images settle before the day's routine erases them, is not mysticism disconnected from reality. It is a practice of self-knowledge that the introverted intuitive already carries out instinctively, but that can be deepened with intention. When dreams are treated as data, not as literal prophecies, but as symbolic language of the psyche, they become an extraordinary resource for anticipation, integration, and inner guidance. Up to this point, we have talked about abilities, pattern perception, symbolic reading, the relationship with dreams, deep processing in silence. But there is a concrete cost that no honest conversation about this type can ignore. It is the weight of carrying perceptions that nobody asked for, and that people often do not want to hear. The cycle is familiar to those who live it. The introverted intuitive perceives something about a person, about a situation, about the direction an environment is heading. They try to share it. They are dismissed, minimized, or actively pushed back against. They keep it to themselves. What they had perceived is confirmed later, sometimes weeks, sometimes months later. And the confirmation does not come with acknowledgement. It comes alone, in silence, like proof that no one had asked for and that no one will explicitly honor. This cycle creates a specific form of existential exhaustion. It is not physical tiredness. It is the exhaustion of seeing clearly and being treated as if you are seeing through fog. It is the exhaustion of constantly calibrating how much of your perception is safe to share, of filtering what you know through what others are willing to hear, of living a reduced version of yourself so as not to be dismissed entirely. It is a kind of loneliness that does not go away in the presence of others. On the contrary, it sometimes intensifies precisely there, in the moment you notice something important and already know, before you open your mouth, that it will be wasted. What needs to be said here, and carefully, because the distinction matters, is that this weight does not need to turn into bitterness. A bitterness is what happens when the perception that was systematically dismissed turns into resentment toward those who could not hear it. And resentment, like any unprocessed emotion, shuts off access to exactly the abilities the introverted intuitive needs most. The alternative to bitterness is not resignation. It is discernment. It is learning to carefully choose who deserves what you perceive. It is understanding that others' inability to receive your perception is not evidence that it is wrong. It is evidence that they have not yet developed the instrument to pick it up. That distinction changes everything. One of the most extraordinary and most unsettling for those on the outside abilities that the introverted intuitive carries is the perception of the shadow. Jung developed the concept of the shadow as the dimension of the psyche that each person represses, the aspects of themselves that consciousness does not want to acknowledge as its own. Impulses, fears, desires, weaknesses, which are then pushed into the unconscious and projected onto others. The introverted intuitive has an uncommon capacity to perceive this shadow, both their own and other people's. When in conversation with someone, they frequently pick up not only on what the person is saying, but on what they are avoiding saying. Not just what they express, but what they repress. Not just who they believe themselves to be, but who they are afraid of being. This perception is not mind reading. It is pattern reading. It is the unconscious integration of microsignals that reveal contradictions between what is presented and what is avoided. The problem is that this ability, without maturity, can easily convert into judgment. When the introverted intuitive perceives someone's shadow and reacts to it, whether by pulling away or by making a direct observation the other person was not ready to hear, the result is frequently conflict and the label of intense, arrogant, or presumptuous. Because perceiving what someone is not willing to see in themselves is an unsolicited invasion of psychic privacy, however involuntary the perception may be. Maturity here lies in understanding that perceiving someone else's shadow is not a license to expose it. It is a responsibility of care. When the perception of another person's incoherence is processed with compassion, with the understanding that everyone represses what they have not yet been able to integrate, it transforms from judgment into deep empathy. The introverted intuitive who has developed this maturity does not use their perception to condemn others, but to understand them in a way that others rarely understand themselves. That is the opposite of judgment. It is one of the rarest forms of human care available. Nietzsche used a word to describe the collective of people who absorb values, beliefs, and structures without ever questioning them. The herd. Not as an insult, as a sociological description of a real dynamic. The herd is not composed of stupid or bad people. It is composed of people who accepted the implicit contract that every society offers. Follow the established rules, value what is valued, question only what is permitted to be questioned, and you will have belonging, safety, and approval. The introverted intuitive has a structural difficulty with that contract. Not out of adolescent rebellion, out of symbolic perception. Their capacity to see patterns inevitably leads them to detect the incoherencies in structures that most people accept without question. The incoherence of the religious institution that preaches compassion and practices exclusion. The incoherence of the economic system that talks about meritocracy while perpetuating inherited privilege. The incoherence of the work environment that talks about innovation, but punishes any idea that threatens the established hierarchy. These incoherencies are not invisible to others. They are simply ignored out of convenience or out of fear of the consequences of seeing them. The price of not making that choice, of not ignoring what is inconvenient to see, is high. The introverted intuitive who questions structures gets labeled as complicated, difficult, nonconformist, someone who just can't accept things the way they are. In professional settings, this frequently translates into being passed over for promotions, being excluded from decision-making groups, being acknowledged only when what they question proves to be correct. And even then, the acknowledgement rarely comes with their name on it. But the questioning that the introverted intuitive brings to structures is not gratuitous. It is the function that every society needs and that few can tolerate. The function of keeping alive the question of whether what was built still makes sense. Without that questioning, systems calcify, institutions become ends in themselves, and genuine innovation, the kind that emerges from a true perception of inadequacy, becomes impossible. The introverted intuitive does not question for the pleasure of tearing things down. They question because they simply cannot unsee what they see. And what they see, frequently, is what the system would need to hear in order to survive itself. There is an aspect of the introverted intuitive's experience that could be described, without exaggeration, as alchemical. Jung was fascinated by alchemy not as proto-chemistry, but as symbolic language for the process of inner transformation. And the goal of the alchemist was not only to transform lead into material gold, it was, symbolically, to transform the raw material of human experience into something of superior value, to transform suffering into wisdom, chaos into clarity, the wound into an instrument of perception. The introverted intuitive rarely experiences suffering passively. There is in their psyche an almost instinctive drive to seek the meaning behind the pain, to not accept the experience as simply bad, but to ask, what is this showing me? What does this fracture reveal about something I had not yet understood? What does this failure unveil about a pattern I needed to see? This process is not positive thinking dressed up as spirituality. It is genuine work of integration, taking what hurt and transforming it into a lens of greater clarity. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming progressively more whole, not by avoiding the shadowy parts of oneself, but by integrating them, by recognizing that what was repressed, rejected, considered unacceptable, in one's own psyche and in one's own life path, carries essential information about who one is. That the wound is not only the place where pain entered, it is also the place where consciousness can enter, if the wound is looked at with honesty rather than numbed with anesthesia. For the introverted intuitive, this alchemical process is often not chosen. It is compulsory. They simply cannot let a painful experience pass without processing it. While others manage to file away what hurt and move forward with relative ease, the introverted intuitive returns to the archive, sometimes compulsively, and searching for the meaning they have not yet extracted. From the outside, this can look like an inability to move on, like rumination, like weakness. It is, in fact, the process by which pain converts into intelligence. And intelligence, over time, into compassion. What needs to be said honestly, though, is that this process has limits. There are moments when the search for meaning converts into circular rumination, when the intuitive mind, instead of extracting gold from the experience, keeps circling around the lead without being able to move forward. Knowing the difference between genuine processing and anxious rumination is a skill the introverted intuitive needs to actively develop, and it is one of the most important for their long-term psychological health. Throughout human history, and in virtually all the traditions that Jung studied in depth, from indigenous to Gnostic, from alchemical to Eastern mythological, there is a recurring pattern. The hero, the sage, the initiate, goes through a period of isolation before emerging transformed. The 40 days in the desert, the retreat on the mountain, the descent into the underworld, the period in darkness before rebirth. These patterns are not just beautiful narratives. They are symbolic maps of a real psychological process that Jung identified and articulated with academic rigor. The introverted intuitive goes through these periods, often without choosing to, often without understanding what is happening. Phases in which they withdraw from the world more than usual, in which social energy drains faster, in which the desire for withdrawal intensifies to the point of feeling irresistible. Seen from the outside, these phases look like crisis, like depression, like a failure to adapt. Others demand presence, a demand the introverted intuitive carries as yet more proof that something is fundamentally wrong with them. What the symbolic traditions that Jung studied suggest, and what clinical experience with this type frequently confirms, is that these periods are, very often, the exact opposite of failure. They are phases of deep reorganization of the psyche, moments when something that had structured itself in a way that no longer served needs to dissolve before a new organization can emerge. Moments when consciousness is literally expanding, and which, like any expansion, require that what was solid temporarily become fluid. I am not saying this to romanticize suffering. There are forms of withdrawal that are genuinely pathological, that lead to no reorganization whatsoever, only stagnation. The distinction between initiation and collapse is real and important. But what needs to be said is that the introverted intuitive has been taught to treat every phase of withdrawal as pathology, as something to be corrected, measured, medicated, forcibly normalized. And that automatic interpretation can interfere with a process that, with adequate support and understanding of one's own nature, would have had a very different outcome. The symbolic initiation does not end in withdrawal. It ends in the return. And the return of the introverted intuitive after a period of inner reorganization is, when successful, marked by a clarity, a depth, and a capacity for presence that was not available before. Not because the crisis was overcome through sheer willpower, but because something genuinely new emerged from the process. There is a specific danger that the introverted intuitive needs to recognize, not to be terrified by it, but to be able to avoid it consciously. It is what happens when their abilities are not recognized as legitimate, neither by themselves nor by the environment around them, for long enough. The result is not the extinction of those abilities. It is their deformation. Jung warned of the dangers of repressing the dominant function of the personality. When what you genuinely are, the function that guides your perception in the most natural and profound way, is systematically discredited, that function does not disappear. It converts. The perception that should have become insight turns into anxiety. The sensitivity that should have become depth turns into hypersensitivity with no outlet. The introspection that should have become self-knowledge turns into paralyzing rumination. The ability to see patterns that should have become wisdom turns into a kind of internal detector that never shuts off. One that sees threats in neutral patterns, that anticipates crises that never materialize, that creates a state of constant alertness with no real object. The symptoms of an introverted intuitive living in denial of their own nature are recognizable, though rarely diagnosed with this precision. Anxiety that seems to come out of nowhere and for which rational analysis finds no cause. A persistent feeling that something is fundamentally wrong with the world, odd with relationships, with themselves, without being able to articulate what. Chronic difficulty fitting into environments that seem to work just fine for everyone else. Exhaustion that does not go away with physical rest, because it is not physical. Moments of intense clarity interspersed with periods of deep fog, in which the perception that is normally sharp seems completely blunted. What is cruel about this picture is that the very world that creates the conditions for this state frequently interprets it as confirmation that the introverted intuitive needed to be corrected all along. See, I told you that you were too sensitive. Look at what it led to. What is, in fact, the consequence of denying a nature is presented as proof that that nature is the problem. And the cycle closes in on itself, tighter than before. The way out is not to become something else. It is to recognize what you are, with clarity, without romanticization and without self-punishment, and to find sustainable ways to inhabit that nature. We have reached the most practical and most delicate point of everything that has been said so far. Because everything that was named, pattern perception, symbolic reading, the relationship with the unconscious, the alchemical capacity, these are real abilities. And real abilities need cultivation, structure, conscious practice. Without that, they continue to operate, but without direction, without an anchor, without the discernment necessary for them to be a source of depth rather than a bottomless sea. Jung proposed the concept of the transcendent function as the capacity to integrate opposites without being consumed by either, and the inner world and the outer world. Deep perception and concrete action. The inward dive and the return to the world. For the introverted intuitive, this integration is the central work of a lifetime. And it is not work that ever gets completed, but work that is continuously practiced. Reflective writing is one of the most effective practices available for this type, not writing as production, as something that will be read, judged, published. Writing as dialogue with oneself, as the space where the intuition that has not yet taken form finds words, where the symbol that appeared in a dream finds context, where the perception that got stuck in the body during a social interaction finally finds release. Writing regularly, with no purpose beyond processing, is one of the most direct ways the introverted intuitive has of transforming what they perceive into something that can be integrated rather than accumulated. The dialogue with dreams, keeping a notebook by the bed, recording the images before the routine erases them, Returning to them during the day with curiosity and without rushing to interpret is another practice that this type often abandons for lack of structure. Although they carry it out naturally when there is space for it, it is not about interpreting dreams rigidly, as if each symbol had a fixed meaning. It is about creating a conscious channel of communication with what the unconscious is processing, and learning over time the specific language that your own psyche uses to communicate with itself. Artistic creation, in any form. Writing, music, visual arts, and any language that allows the symbolic to express itself without the limitation of linear logic, is for many introverted intuitives not merely a pleasure, but a psychological necessity. It is the channel through which the extraordinarily rich inner life finds expression without having to justify itself, without needing to be understood by others in order to have value. The art does not need to be good in a technical sense to serve this function. It needs to be honest. And finally, conscious periods of withdrawal and return. Not the compulsive withdrawal that happens when the system collapses, but the intentional withdrawal that happens as regular maintenance. By creating structures that allow the introverted intuitive to have time and space for silence, not as a guilt-ridden concession to selfishness, but as a health practice, is one of the most important ways of cultivating depth without being swallowed by it. And also creating return points, moments of genuine contact with chosen people, with the concrete world, with the body, that function as anchors when the inward dive goes too deep. There is a line from Nietzsche that echoes through much of what has been said here, although he wrote it in a different context. One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. The introverted intuitive frequently experiences that chaos, the chaos of perception that surpasses what the environment can absorb, of sensitivity that goes beyond what culture can honor, and of depth that finds no reciprocity in the shallow. And for a long time, that chaos is lived only as a burden, as evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with whoever carries it. What this video attempted to do, with all the limitations of any attempt to map what is, by its very nature, immeasurable, is show that this chaos has structure, that the perception that seems excessive is a high-resolution ability, that the sensitivity that seems like weakness is the condition of access to layers of reality that most people simply never reach, that the silence that seems like absence is the most sophisticated processing environment available to this type, that the solitude that seems like defeat is often the condition for the thinking that matters most. And Jung spent decades mapping the inner territory that most people are afraid to enter. And what he found there, in the personal unconscious, in the collective unconscious, in the symbols that appear in the dreams of cultures separated by millennia, was a richness that the surface has no way of containing. The introverted intuitive lives in that territory as a condition of existence, not by choice, by nature. And for a long time, that nature was presented to them as a problem to be solved. The real change begins when that narrative is reversed. When the question is no longer, how can I be different from what I am? But how can I be more fully what I am, with more clarity, more care, and less unnecessary cost? That is not arrogance. It is not self-indulgence. It is the kind of honesty that Jung would call psychological courage. The willingness to recognize your own nature without diminishing it to fit into other people's expectations, and without inflating it beyond what is real. You are not broken. You never were. You are a rare type in a world that is still learning to recognize the value of what does not fit into the metrics it created to measure value. That is genuinely challenging, without any romanticization. But it is also precisely the point from which the most important journey someone of your type can undertake begins. The journey of understanding yourself with enough honesty to inhabit your own depth with dignity, and without apologizing for existing the way you exist.